back.
And Josh, almost everybody didn't know because you almost forgot that title there, didn't you?
I had it in front of me, so I wouldn't.
Okay, gotcha.
Because I know it's pretty long.
I had faith in you, Josh.
Yep.
This album was released May 14th, 1969. And a little bit about Neil Young. He was born November 12th, 1945 in Toronto, Canada. He started playing music in high school in Winnipeg and eventually dropped out of school to become a musician. His first band was formed in 1963 and known as the Squires. While playing with this band at a club called the Flamingo, this is where he met Stephen Stills for the first time. Also around this time, after he left the Squires, he met Joni Mitchell, as well as starting songwriting full-time or more seriously. His first major songwriting success was titled Flying on the Ground is Wrong by the Winnipeg band The Guess Who. And so
they had a pretty famous song, if you remember correctly.
Yes, I can't remember what it was, but
American Woman.
Oh, right.
Mm-hmm.
Good old.
Oh, I thought that was a Lenny Kravitz song.
It is, and yet it so isn't, Matt.
In 1966 in Toronto, he joined the band The Minor Birds, which was fronted by none other than Rick James. However,
wow.
I know, right?
That honest, as a side note, I've always found that might be my favorite piece of music trivia, particularly from the 60s, that Neil Young was in a band with Rick James before either were really popular.
I had no idea that was
you
a
didn't
thing,
know that?
So that was remarkable, yes.
Yeah,
they were an R&B group. And however, that band was short-lived as Rick James was eventually arrested for being AWOL from the Navy Reserves. So not even drug-related yet. Yeah,
he was probably somewhat drug-related. I mean, he was probably off doing coke somewhere.
Was he grinding his boots into the couch at that point, or did that happen later in the Chappelle Show lore? So yeah,
he was writing party all the time and wondering who he might get to sing that in the 80s.
Yeah, it's pretty early on. He must have been he must have been young. Neil Young then moved to L.A. with the bass player Bruce Palmer. They apparently sold some of the instruments from the band and bought a car and then left for LA.
Is there anybody who more stumbled into various you got Rick James, you got Bruce Palmer, he ends up eventually with Crosby, Stills, and Nash. He's Joni Mitchell, he's just floating between all these
Pearl
different
Jam.
folks.
Yep.
Later, yeah.
a lot of crossover. When they reached LA in 1966, Young and Palmer met up by chance with Stephen Stills and Richie Furay and Dewey Martin and formed Buffalo Springfield. They stayed together for about 2 years, despite the tensions within the group, and Bruce Palmer also being deported. And then they split up for good in May of 1968. As Neil then went solo and signed a deal with the record label Reprise Records, who Joni Mitchell was also on, and they both shared a manager in Elliot Roberts, who actually managed Neil Young until he died in 2019, so he was his lifelong manager. Neil Young released his first solo album titled Neil Young in January 22nd of 1969, which is only 4 months before this album. For the album we are talking about today, Young recruited the musicians Crazy Horse from a band that was called the Rockets and were renamed Crazy Horse after the famous Native American general or military leader. We have Danny Whitten on guitar, Billy Talbot on bass guitar, and Ralph Molina on drums. Young had met them earlier in the Buffalo Springfield days, and that's where they crossed paths, and he also played with them on a gig at one point. Everybody knows This Is Nowhere. On the cover says Neil Young with Crazy Horse, and that's always how it is. So it's never Neil Young and Crazy Horse, or they get separate billing, I guess is what I'm trying to say. On this album, in fact, Running Dry Requiem for the Rockets is a tribute to that former band, and in fact the violin player that was in the Rockets makes an appearance on that track, and that is Bobby Notkoff. Everybody Knows This Is Nowhere was released a mere 4 months after the debut album, as I said. It was recorded at Wally Heider Studio in Hollywood, which is a sister studio to the Wally Heider Studio in Oakland, where Crosby, Stills, and Nash recorded their album, and Creedence recorded their album. It peaked at the album peaked at number 34 on the Billboard charts in August of 1970, so a little bit later. And this album spent 98 weeks on the Billboard 200. However, it was critically received positively, but it didn't sell like gangbusters. I guess it sold for a long period of time. It kind of stayed on the charts for a long period of time, but it wasn't like this smash hit success. The album itself was recorded in just 2 weeks and includes the songs Cinnamon Girl, Cowgirl in the Sand, and Down by the River, and the title track were all apparently written by Neil Young when he was in bed with 103-degree fever. And that's the famous kind of anecdote about this album.
Wow.
Yep.
He should get fevers more often.
I know, right? Cinnamon Girl was the single off of this album, and it reached number 55 on the pop charts. Neil Young is credited as the sole songwriter on all the tracks on this album. And finally, as John said, we're going to be covering Neil Young in the 70s 4 more times. So I'm not going to do too much after this, but in July of 1969, a few months after this album was released, he joined Crosby, Stills, and Nash, while also continuing to release solo albums. So that's a little bit about Neil Young. There's a good documentary on YouTube that is a BBC production that's not available on disc or streaming anywhere, so I had to go to YouTube. I have not watched it yet, but I plan to. But that was, based on my research, that was kind of the most highly regarded one. It gives a nice overview of his career. And also he has an autobiography and a biography called Shaky, which is often considered like one of the best works about him if people are interested in learning more about Neil Young. He's very prolific, as I also learned. He's putting out albums constantly. I think he even put out an album this year, and he's always collaborating with people as well, like Pearl Jam. So, Matt, what did you think? I know you dropped the hint last week that you like this album, so tell me what your experience is like this time around.
Like is an understatement. I love this album, and I love Neil Young. I have a weird relationship with Neil Young because, like, when I remember first hearing about him, my parents are Neil Young fans, or at least particularly my mom. And I remember she got Harvest Moon, which I don't know if you guys know that record, but that's for like, I don't know if it's in the 80s or 90s, but it's a very...
It's the 90s.
90s, okay. So it's a very acoustic, kind of mellow record, and I did not like that as a kid, like listening to that. I was like, what the hell? Like, why are we listening to this? So my initial reaction to Neil Young growing up wasn't very positive. But over the years, it definitely grew, and this album is one of the reasons why. I think this record is fantastic. I never get sick of it. I like the variety of like the long jammy songs, the short poppier songs, kind of like the creepy Running Dry, Requiem for the Rockets. The penultimate track is just like this, and I could see why people. It's almost like, I don't know if somebody's playing the Saw. You know, like when people play the Saw, like, you know, like
the weird twangy.
Yeah, like
sound.
It's got that. I don't think that's what it is, but it sounds like it could be that. But Neil Young is just someone that I just admire so much. I get why people don't like him. His voice is certainly unique. It's kind of like almost a Dylan-esque type of thing where if people hate it or just, you know, it's just cringeworthy for them, that I understand that. It makes sense. But this album is great. And I think we've talked about this before, John. I think maybe you're talking about your friend Jeff, who plays like, I don't know, certain songs on a jukebox in a bar, and they're really long or whatever.
Yep.
And so for me, two of my biggest jukebox bar songs are Down by the River and Cowgirl in the Sand. I want to get bang for my buck, and those songs are just fantastic.
You're that guy.
I'm that guy. I'm totally that guy.
There's no indictment of either of those songs, by the way, but I have a 5-minute rule for songs that you put on a jukebox, because anything more than it, then you're that prick who's taken up 3 spots instead of 1 for your jukebox.
Listen. That's smart, man. Like that's getting banged from my 50 cents or whatever. You know, like you can do it too. But no, I don't even know how to just describe. Okay. So I'll say this about Neil Young. I love the aspect of him in his career that he's one of those guys that just does whatever he wants. He's has a ton of records, as Josh said. He's always writing stuff. He's got a ton of terrible albums, right? There's a lot of Neil Young that's bad, but I've always thought of that. Like I remember, I don't know if it was a college professor or somebody saying once that like some of the greatest artists are the ones that like, you know, they are prolific and sometimes they're searching for something or they're reaching for something and it doesn't always hit, right? Sometimes it just falls flat. And Neil Young is certainly one of those artists, but he doesn't fall flat here for his second album. I don't really know his first album, so I can't really compare this to that.
Yeah, I was going to ask about that.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, there's plenty of Neil Young that I don't know, but I love everything about him. His overall, you know, his just his whole sonic aesthetic is really pleasing to me, and I think this is a great album. It's got some long tracks, and it's got Cinnamon Girl as a classic, you know, 60s song. There's roots rock stuff in here, which you guys know that I really like, and everybody knows This Is Nowhere's a great, just quick pop song. So you got a little bit of both the quick, you know, pop songs and the longer kind of jammy rock songs. He's a great guitar player too. I think that's the other thing you got to say about Neil Young. He certainly has his own style of guitar playing, and if you ever see him live, even still as like an old man, he crushes it. So can't say enough about Neil Young. Love this album. I think this might be my favorite Neil Young album. It's certainly up at the top 2 probably, but I love it. It's great.
Matt, were you at Bonnaroo in 2011? I saw that they played
Buffalo Springfield.
Yeah.
Yep.
Buffalo Springfield.
I saw that. Yep.
That's awesome. Okay. Yeah, I was kind of going back and reading about Crazy Horse and Buffalo Springfield a little bit to get some background.
I know that Neil Young and Stephen Stills have a very, like, Neil Young always seems to crush Stephen Stills' dreams of like doing things, because Neil Young's kind of a cantankerous old man, and Stephen Stills is trying to do stuff with him, and Neil Young has been known to pull the plug on reunions and stuff like that, like mid-tour. So they have certainly an interesting relationship.
All right. What about you, John? What did you think of this album?
Oh, I mean, this is a great album, and I love Neil Young too. And Neil Young is the spiritual father to so many types of music that I love. Like when you listen to this album, the first thing that just immediately pops out to you is how much of a grandfather to grunge music Neil Young is. I mean, the riffs, the sludgy, at times sloppy, but also heavy riffs that, you know, it's no surprise that he played a ton with Pearl Jam, but there's elements of, you know, all of the grunge bands and what he does, not to mention the antecedent bands for the grunge bands like the Pixies and, you know, Meat Puppets and Melvins. I mean, they're all grandfathered by Neil Young, right? With that sludgy, heavy riffs. There's a lot of noise rock that takes the sound of Neil Young and then explodes it out into different stuff. But once again, like bands I really love, like, you know, Sonic Youth comes to mind immediately, but, you know, Yo La Tengo, bands like that, they get sloppier and more experimental with it, but they go for the same guitar tone that Neil Young does. And he's the grandfather of so many different types of music, especially in the 80s and 90s, that I really love. So right off the bat, like, if you want to hear pretty much, in my opinion, the first real grunge album, like this has a real claim to it. So if you like that type of guitar tone of grunge music, for those that may not be as familiar with Neil Young, you're going to love his stuff. He has a distinctive voice, but the thing that I always also appreciate about Neil Young is, unlike some other folks with distinctive voices, he doesn't overstay his welcome in singing. He's very good at giving you singing parts and then stretching out the music, but he's as good at making long songs as anyone we've come across in the 60s. And you know, we've kind of had a running joke about how everybody seems to have to put a long song on their album and how some sometimes they're so ponderous, right? Neil Young is not. He does not have that problem. He manages to take, in this case, he's got a song that I believe is in the 12-minute range, maybe a little less. The last track, Cowgirl on the Sand. What's that running at?
10:06.
10 minutes. Okay, yeah, so not quite that long. And then there's another song that's Down by the River. It's got to be 8 or 9 minutes as well.
Yep.
But they don't feel burdensome.
No.
And he can write a 2-minute and 30-second song as well as he can write a 9-minute song. And I am a guy who sometimes, get me out of there after 5 or 6 minutes. But Neil Young has a unique gift of giving you just enough vocal and just enough deviation from what he's doing that you're always with him, but not losing track. And that's really the story of this album. It's a mix of long songs with short songs. There isn't a lot of instrumentation. There's a lot of violin, and there's a lot of like heavy guitar. The percussion is, and you know me, I always immediately identify bass and drums pretty much off the bat. But you're not gonna you're gonna hear Neil Young's guitar before anything. In fact, I heard the violin even before I heard the rhythm section. Not to say the rhythm section isn't good in this album, but it's very much designed to be in the background, kind of like grunge in some ways, that the distorted guitar goes out in the front and the vocals. The songwriting, I think, is excellent. The lyrics are very good. Neil Young is gifted with writing sparse lyrics that are universal, but also profound in their own way. And I know that sounds like an oxymoron, but it's not brilliant lyricism, but it's not eye-rolling or cringe-worthy stuff either. He writes, and you can kind of come in wherever however you're hearing it. So just for those that have never listened to Neil Young before, this starts a run of about 3 or 4 albums before, I think that the story is that he was trying to get out of his record contract and start experimenting, and you get some interesting albums. But this starts a run of like 3 or 4 just phenomenal albums. Yeah, and it's great. I mean, it's a star being born, and it sounds just as good today as it sounded in 1969. There's other albums that have been there, but this is one of the few albums I could say could be released this year and still be a hit. It does not seem dated at all. So there's my initial takes.
Well, I agree with you guys. This album was a real discovery for me. I realized I really didn't know much Neil Young outside of his kind of biggest hits, and I had never listened to any of his albums in full. I think I have seen his music doc Heart of Gold, and that's really kind of my only frame of reference for him other than being in Crosby, Stills and Nash. And this album was awesome. Honestly, I don't think I had ever heard Cinnamon Girl before, or at least knew that it was him that sang it.
Wow. Okay.
So from the opening guitar in that, I was like, holy crap, this is amazing. And like John said, it sounds so modern and grungy. It hooked me right away. And to be fair, that song doesn't sound like the other songs on this album. So don't go in expecting like all hard guitar.
But the guitar tone does. The tone does. But the how he plays it sounds different.
Yeah. And the guitar solos in those other long songs are really great. And that's what makes it. He comes in and out with those, and they're different throughout the longer songs. And it is really like weighty, and the songs just kind of fly by as a result, even though they're long. I like the mix of country. On this album, he does that really well. There's also some folk thrown in that works really well, and he seems to be a master at like combining those three things in different ways really well, to the point of influencing a lot of bands after the fact.
He has always reminded me of Tom Petty a little bit, in the sense that he writes a great chorus, and that's a gift. And this album is filled with great choruses. I think like It Won't Be Long, Round and Round is the name of the song, but It Won't Be Long in parentheses is exceptional.
Yeah, that song is kind of the one song I didn't like as much as the rest, but it's that's just a minor blip. Mostly because I didn't like the singing, the backing vocals on that with the chorus and the la la las. kind of.
I think the more you listen to this album and the more you listen to Neil Young, Josh, if this is you just getting your feet wet, the more that's the type of song that will seep into your bones as you listen to him.
Yeah.
Because that's what sounds. Would you say, Matt, that sounds the most like Harvest, which is going to come down the road? That's almost like a preview. Yeah.
Yeah, it's like a slower, because you'll see that with Neil Young in those latter records, or the latter after this, which he does go more mellow, more Americana folk kind of thing. And yeah, that's probably a good point, John.
Yeah, just the fact that, setting that aside, just the fact that he's such a strong guitar player, which I don't think I realized, and how standout that is on this album, made it really worth it for me. To the point I just went ahead and bought the album today.
Yeah.
And
yeah,
I do like the violin on Running Dry a lot. I think that's well done. I think that is what you're hearing, Matt. There's no other instruments listed.
There's no saw.
I think it's just the violin. And
I have seen a band use that. There's a Frontier Ruckus, I believe, is the name of the band, and I saw them play with it live. And the dude was playing a full blown saw, and it was you can do that.
Cleaning the stacks next week. What bands have played saws in the album? So right there, Gauntlet is laid down.
Maybe something like Alison Krauss, or I don't know, some Appalachian band probably. But yeah, this, and it's also, like you said, he's a really good songwriter. There's not a lot of tracks on this album. There's 7 in total, so it just breezes by for me, and in a good way. And this is a real high recommendation for me, and I can't wait to see kind of what comes next with it.
And I think I would like to add a couple things. I think first we haven't talked about the bass yet. So I know, John, you're talking about, but there's some cool bass parts in here. Particularly with in those jams that they're doing, like Down by the River and Cowgirl in the Sand, where and it kind of ties into how Neil Young plays his guitar solos, which is just very raw and very it's very deliberate. Like, he hangs on the same note over and over again, and it's not like he's not flashy. I mean, we're going to talk about Hendrix in a little bit, but it's a very different way of playing the guitar, and it sounds kind of rudimentary. It doesn't really sound, it's not complicated, but he just makes it so, he's so passionate. You could tell how into it he's getting, and he's just feeling it, almost like a jazz musician in some pieces here. And then the bass line that's just permeating the background while he's playing that guitar is just such a great combination. And the other
Can I add something to that real quick, Matt, that might emphasize that for people too? He manages to play sharp but sloppy. And not sloppy like experimental, it always seems like he's slightly off tune, or you know what I mean, just enough that it seems like he's mostly on tune, but he's making the decision to be slightly off pitch and tune with his effects. And that's kind of like what a lot of the bands he influenced took away from him, sort of that idea.
Exactly.
But I do want to mention that though, because Matt described the way his solos and the way his guitar is pieced in perfectly, but it's like you also have to hear it with that slight off kilterness that is the Neil Young, and his voice is like that too, a little bit. He hangs on to stuff a little bit longer, and so it goes along with his guitar playing.
That's a really good point, John, and that I think ties in more to how he is considered the godfather of grunge and these alternative rock bands that came later on in the 80s and 90s, about how you just throw in off notes and off things that are slightly out of key. He's certainly not playing within the normal structure of a scale or anything like that. He'll throw in little things here like that are a little off tune, and that certainly is influential on those bands later on that were getting a little bit more experimental. And then there's also some weird kind of there's some psychedelic stuff that's going on in here that's not a traditional psychedelic type sound either. It's a very
just a sprinkling.
Just a sprinkling. It's got an undertone. It's a very kind of, but it is there, you know what I mean? And I'll go to Running Dry. I think, that's there. That's just that kind of, that guitar picking that he's doing along with the violin that sounds like a saw. It's still got that 60s vibe of the psychedelia as well. There's a lot of stuff going on here. This is just a fantastically, it's an intricate, complex album, but it's also very simple in a lot of ways too. And it's one of those things that's it's just everything kind of all together. It's great. It's vintage Neil Young.
And one thing too I'd like to say is the first thought I had when listening to it is, God, this is like so the first grunge album. Not that I wasn't familiar with this, but like it immediately hit me. Wow. Mm-hmm. And then the second thing was, we listened to Crosby, Stills, and Nash so recently that I couldn't help but think, like, as I was listening to this, because obviously this was right before he joined. I was like, this is, as much as I like that Crosby, Stills, and Nash album, it's like, well, yeah, this is the piece that's the last part. The guitar here is what gives them, and I know a little bit of the CSNY sound, but it was just very funny to hear that album and then hear Neil Young at the same time, and then in your brain start merging it and going, yeah, there it is. That's
and that kind of goes back to, I think I mentioned this when we did the Crosby, Stills and Nash album, was like when I saw Crosby, Stills and Nash live and they were good. And then I saw with a bunch of family members, and then my family members, the same people that I went to that show with, saw them with Neil Young, and they were like, it was so much better. Like Neil Young just brings this energy and brings this like edge to them, and he takes over. You know what I mean? So, so that was even apparent like 10, 15 years ago when that was going on. So nice. He's badass.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. One thing I wanted to add also is that this. From what I've read so far, since none of us had listened to his first album, that this was a departure from the first album. It seemed like the first album was very like kind of almost overproduced in a way, and kind of a different sound than this album. So he was already kind of changing or modifying what he was going to be from album to album. So, and critically, it seemed like some people preferred the first album more to this on initial hearing, and some people like this compared to the first album. So, but yeah, that's about it. High recommend from all of us.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it might be his best album for me.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah.
I don't know if I'd go that far. It's a great album, but there's some pretty tremendous stuff coming down the road. So I'll hold off on that, but it'll be a nice talking point when we get to the 70s, because there's going to be some stuff that we're going to be able to hold up against this, and that'll be really cool, I think, because Matt, you and I both know him very well, and we'll be able to listen and kind of compare and contrast, and I'll be fascinated to hear Josh as he digs in, what his take is.
I gotta say, I love that, and that's
more,
and that's one of the things I love about, because it's happened a couple of times where Josh, I think, Guns N' Roses comes to mind. It's like
that's
introducing
the famous story between the three of us.
Yeah, like just introduce, like knowing when you know a band or an artist, and you're so and somebody else like that, you realize that it's kind of on the same plane as you with music. It's like, oh, I don't really know that, and you're like, oh my god, I get so excited. For that person, you're gonna have a great experience, like to see that happen, and I think that's a really cool thing about being a music fan.
Yeah, it's great. It's great hearing new stuff always.
And it's also great being that person too, like be like, holy crap, how did I not know about this? So
right, connecting on that level is great.
Yeah,